The grand doors of Westminster Abbey swung open with a thunderous echo that silenced the assembled mourners. Every head turned as the Duke of Ashford strode down the aisle, his boots striking the ancient stones with deliberate force. In his gloved hands, he carried a chest that gleamed unmistakably golden, even in the dim cathedral light. Gasps rippled through the congregation. The widow clutched her handkerchief tighter. The new Duke's brother rose half from his seat, face flushed with outrage. For the Duke of Ashford to appear here at the funeral of the man he had publicly despised for 20 years, carrying what appeared to be a fortune in gold, was an insult beyond comprehension. But as he reached the casket and turned to face the assembly, his next words would shatter everything they thought they knew about honor, rivalry, and the hidden noble truth that bound two enemies together. If you are listening to this story, do not forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you are listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. The morning mist clung to the manicured lawns of Ashford Hall as Lionel Hartwell, the young Duke of Ashford, stood at his study window overlooking the vast estate that had been his burden since his father's death 3 years prior. At 28, he carried the title with the grace expected of his lineage, yet beneath the polished exterior lived a man perpetually aware that he had inherited far more than land and wealth. He had inherited a feud. The rivalry between the Dukes of Ashford and Ravenscroft had defined the social landscape of Georgian England for 2 decades. It had begun before Lionel was old enough to understand the nuances of aristocratic pride, rooted in a business venture gone catastrophically wrong, a contested parliamentary vote, and rumours of betrayed confidences at court. The details had become mythologized over the years, embellished by gossip and shaped by wounded egos, until the original transgression was buried beneath layers of retaliatory slights and public confrontations. Lionel's father, the late Duke, had carried the animosity like a banner, refusing to attend any gathering where the Duke of Ravenscroft might appear, speaking his rival's name with a curl of distaste that became one of his defining characteristics. In his final months, racked by illness and bitterness, he had extracted a promise from Lionel: never reconcile with Ravenscroft, never forget the wrongs done to their family, never let the Hartwell name be diminished by forgiveness. It was a deathbed oath that Lionel had given reluctantly, his hand clasped in his father's weakening grip, knowing even then that he was binding himself to a conflict he had never fully understood. But filial duty was absolute, and so young Duke Lionel had assumed not just his title and estates, but his father's hatred as well. The estate itself was magnificent, a testament to generations of careful stewardship and advantageous marriages. The Palladian mansion stood proud against the Cotswold Hills, its honey-coloured stone glowing warmly in afternoon light. Inside, priceless collections of art and literature filled elegant rooms where the finest families in England had gathered for centuries. The agricultural lands were productive and well managed, the tenant farmers prosperous under fair rents. By every measure, Lionel should have been content. Yet there was a hollowness to his privileged existence that he could never quite articulate. His days followed predictable patterns: morning consultations with his steward about crop rotations and roof repairs, afternoons reviewing correspondence and financial reports, evenings spent at tedious social functions where he played the role expected of him. He was unfailingly courteous, appropriately charitable, and resolutely proper. The Tun considered him an eligible catch, though his reluctance to marry had become a source of speculation. His aunt, Lady Catherine Hartwell, his father's widowed sister who had taken up residence at Ashford Hall after her own husband's death, often chided him about his isolation. "You live like a monk, Lionel," she would say, her keen eyes missing nothing. "All duty and no joy. Your father's vendetta has become your prison." He would deflect such observations with practiced ease, but privately he wondered if she was right. The feud with Ravenscroft dictated which invitations he could accept, which business ventures he could pursue, which families he could associate with freely. London society had largely divided into camps, and one had to navigate the invisible boundaries carefully to avoid giving offence. It was exhausting, and Lionel was beginning to admit to himself rather pointless. The current Duke of Ravenscroft, Edmund Thorpe, was by all accounts a formidable man in his 60s, wealthy and influential, with connections to the highest levels of government. Lionel had seen him only from a distance at various functions, a tall figure with silver hair and an imperious bearing. They had never spoken. The rules of their inherited enmity forbade it. On this particular morning, Lionel was reviewing accounts when his butler, Grimsby, entered with unusual hesitation. The elderly servant had been with the family for 40 years and was rarely unsettled, but now his composure showed cracks. "Your Grace, a messenger has arrived from London. The matter is delicate." Lionel gestured for him to continue, noting the sealed letter Grimsby carried on a silver tray. The paper was heavy, expensive, bordered in black. Even before he broke the seal, a cold premonition settled over him. The message was brief and formal. Edmund Thorpe, Duke of Ravenscroft, had died suddenly 2 days prior. The funeral would be held at Westminster Abbey in 3 days' time. The notification was a mere courtesy, a matter of protocol given his rank. No attendance was expected, perhaps not even desired. Lionel sat back in his chair, the letter still in his hand. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction that his family's enemy had fallen. Instead, a curious numbness spread through him. A man was dead, a man his father had hated with consuming passion, and Lionel felt nothing, or rather, he felt the absence of what he was supposed to feel. Lady Catherine found him an hour later, still at his desk, the black-bordered letter before him. She read it without asking permission, her expression thoughtful. "So it ends," she said quietly. "Does it?" Lionel's voice was hollow. His son inherits the title, and presumably the grudge along with it. Nothing ends. It merely continues with different actors. Must it? His aunt's question was deceptively simple. Before he could answer, Grimsby returned with another visitor, this one unexpected and far more unsettling. Mr. Whitmore was a solicitor from Lincoln's Inn, elderly and distinguished, who introduced himself with grave courtesy and requested a private audience on a matter of utmost confidentiality. What the solicitor revealed in the next hour would alter everything Lionel believed about his family, his inheritance, and the rivalry that had defined his entire adult life. As Mr. Whitmore laid out documents, letters, and ledgers, each page turned, revealed a truth more shocking than the last. Lionel felt the foundations of his world shift beneath him. By the time the solicitor departed, Lionel sat alone in his study, surrounded by evidence of a secret that had been kept for 20 years. A secret that transformed his father from victim to villain, and the hated Duke of Ravenscroft from enemy to something far more complex. And with that knowledge came an impossible choice. Attend the funeral of his supposed rival and expose a truth that would scandalize society, or remain silent and let an honorable man go to his grave with his reputation intact while a lie lived on. The weight of gold suddenly seemed trivial compared to the weight of truth. The day of the funeral dawned cold and grey, the London sky heavy with unshed rain. Westminster Abbey loomed before the assembled mourners like a stern judge, its Gothic spires piercing the low clouds. Inside, the aristocracy of England had gathered in their finest mourning attire, a sea of black silk and sombre faces, to pay respects to a man who had been a pillar of their world. The Duke of Ravenscroft's widow, Duchess Margaret, sat in the front pew with her children. The new Duke, Harrison Thorpe, a man of 35 with his father's bearing but lacking his father's warmth, and his younger sister, Lady Beatrice, whose red-rimmed eyes spoke of genuine sorrow. Around them clustered the Thorpe family connections, a network of power and influence that extended through banking, shipping, and politics. The service had proceeded with appropriate solemnity. The Archbishop himself presided, speaking of Edmund Thorpe's contributions to public life, his charitable works, his devotion to family and duty. It was a eulogy, crafted to honor without controversy, touching lightly on achievements while avoiding anything that might remind the gathered elite of the divisions that had marked the deceased Duke's later years. Harrison Thorpe sat rigid beside his mother, his jaw clenched with barely suppressed anger. He had been forced to send notifications to all peers of appropriate rank, including the detestable Duke of Ashford, though he had taken grim satisfaction in making the invitation as coldly formal as possible. He assumed, as did everyone, that Ashford would have the decency to stay away. His father's rival appearing at this moment would be an insult beyond tolerance. The Archbishop was midway through a reading when the sound echoed through the vaulted space, the massive doors opening with a groan of ancient hinges and iron. Every head turned. The collective intake of breath was audible. Lionel Hartwell, Duke of Ashford, stood silhouetted in the doorway. He was dressed impeccably in mourning attire, his tall frame rigid with purpose. But it was what he carried that caused the gasps and whispers to spread like wildfire through the congregation. In his hands was a chest, not overly large but substantial, and even from a distance the gleam was unmistakable. Gold. The whispers became a roar of scandalized murmurs. Harrison Thorpe surged to his feet, his face flushing crimson. Duchess Margaret gripped her daughter's hand, her complexion deathly pale. The Archbishop faltered mid-sentence, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Lionel walked forward with measured steps, his gaze fixed ahead, seemingly impervious to the storm of shock and outrage building around him. Each footfall on the stone floor rang out like a gunshot in the increasingly hostile silence. Mourners pressed back against their pews as if his presence might contaminate them. Fans snapped open as ladies sought to hide their expressions of horror and fascination. "This is unconscionable." Harrison's voice cut through the abbey, sharp with fury. "How dare you? How dare you bring your insulting presence here to my father's funeral, carrying gold like some mercenary flaunting his wages? Have you no decency, no shame?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly. Several gentlemen half rose from their seats, as if preparing to physically remove the interloper. Lady Beatrice had buried her face in her hands. The Duchess sat frozen, her knuckles white against her black gloves. Lionel continued forward until he stood before the casket, draped in the Ravenscroft colours and surrounded by elaborate floral arrangements. Only then did he turn to face the congregation, his expression grave but unrepentant. "I know what you think," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space. "You believe I have come to insult the memory of Edmund Thorpe, to display my triumph over a fallen enemy, to parade wealth before his grieving family in a final act of cruelty." He paused, letting the accusations hang in the air. "You are wrong." "Then explain yourself," Harrison demanded, moving into the aisle, his hands clenched into fists. "Explain what possible justification you could have for this obscenity." Lionel set the chest down carefully before the casket. The sound of it settling on the stone was heavy, solid. He straightened and met Harrison's furious gaze with steady composure. "This chest contains £10,000 in gold sovereigns," he announced clearly. "It represents a debt." The confusion was palpable. A debt? What debt could exist between mortal enemies? "My father," Lionel continued, his voice rough with emotion he could no longer suppress, "spent the last 20 years of his life cultivating a public rivalry with Edmund Thorpe. He spoke of betrayal, of business deals gone wrong, of wrongs that demanded eternal enmity. I inherited that hatred as surely as I inherited my title. I was raised to despise the Duke of Ravenscroft, to consider him an enemy to my family's honor." He drew a breath, visibly steadying himself. 3 days ago, a solicitor came to me with documents my father had kept locked away, meant to be revealed only after the death of both parties. I learned the truth about the rivalry that shaped my entire life. The abbey was utterly silent now, every person straining to hear. Even Harrison had stopped advancing, caught between outrage and unwilling curiosity. 23 years ago, Lionel said, each word deliberate and clear, my father made catastrophic investments against the advice of his financial advisors. He was young, arrogant, convinced of his own brilliance. He invested in speculative ventures in the Americas that collapsed spectacularly. Within months, the Ashford estate was on the brink of complete ruin. We would have lost everything, every acre, every stone of our ancestral home. My father's pride would not let him admit his failure publicly. He could not bear the shame. Lionel's gaze swept the assembly, meeting shocked eyes and slack faces. Edmund Thorpe discovered the truth. He came to my father privately and offered a solution. He would loan the Ashford estate £15,000, enough to satisfy the most pressing debts and stabilize the holdings. The loan would be secret, known only to them and their solicitors. The interest would be minimal, the repayment terms generous. There would be no public humiliation, no loss of status. A collective gasp echoed through the abbey. Duchess Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Harrison stood transfixed, his earlier fury transforming into confusion. My father accepted, Lionel continued, his voice thick with shame and anger at the dead. He took Edmund Thorpe's money, saved our family from disgrace, and then he created the feud. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Whispers erupted, shocked and disbelieving. He fabricated grievances, spread rumors of Ravenscroft's duplicity in business matters, manufactured slights and betrayals that never occurred. He turned his benefactor into his enemy because he could not bear being indebted to another man. Pride consumed him. He would rather be seen as the wronged party in a rivalry than as the failed investor rescued by another's generosity. Lionel's hands trembled as he gestured to the chest. My father made payments over the years, in secret, always maintaining the public fiction of enmity. When he died, £5,000 remained unpaid. Edmund Thorpe never demanded it, never exposed my father's lies. He maintained the pretense of rivalry because to do otherwise would have revealed the truth and destroyed the Hartwell name. He bore the burden of being called my father's enemy for 20 years to protect our family's reputation. The journey back to Ashford Hall from London felt interminable, though in reality it was merely the usual day's travel by coach. Lionel sat in the plush interior, exhausted beyond measure, replaying the scene at Westminster Abbey with the persistence of a recurring nightmare. After his revelation, the Abbey had erupted into chaos. Some mourners had defended his courage in speaking truth, others had condemned him for airing such scandal at a funeral. Harrison Thorpe had stood paralyzed, his understanding of his father and his family's history shattered in an instant. Duchess Margaret had risen with trembling dignity and approached Lionel. Her words, spoken quietly enough that only those nearest could hear, had cut him to his core. My husband was the finest man I ever knew. You have restored his honor, but at what cost to your own? Then she had returned to her seat, leaving Lionel to make his retreat through a gauntlet of stunned faces and whispered speculation. The newspapers would be merciless, he knew. The scandal would dominate conversation for months. The revelation that one of England's most notorious aristocratic feuds had been built on a foundation of lies and wounded pride would send shockwaves through the ton. His father's reputation would be destroyed, and by extension, his own honor would be questioned. Some would admire his honesty, but many would condemn him for exposing family shame so publicly. Aunt Catherine was waiting when his coach finally pulled up to Ashford Hall. She had remained behind, claiming age and health prevented the journey to London, though Lionel suspected she had simply wanted to give him the freedom to act without her witnessing presence. She took one look at his haggard face and ordered tea sent to the drawing room immediately. I told them, he said simply, slumping into a chair before the fire. Everything. I brought the gold, announced the debt, and revealed the entire sordid truth before half of England's aristocracy. Catherine poured tea with steady hands, her expression unreadable. "And how do you feel?" "Like I've betrayed my father's memory and humiliated our family name in one grand gesture," Lionel said bitterly. "Exactly as I expected to feel. Do you regret it?" The question hung between them. Lionel stared into his teacup, watching the leaves swirl. "No," he finally admitted. "Edmund Thorpe died, with society believing him a schemer and an enemy. His family believed the rivalry was real, rooted in legitimate grievance. They deserved the truth. He deserved the truth." He looked up at his aunt. "But that doesn't make the cost any less steep." The following days proved his prediction accurate. London newspapers arrived filled with lurid accounts of the funeral scene, each publication spinning the revelation according to their political allegiances and readership. Some praised Duke Lionel's integrity and condemned his father's deception. Others questioned why he had chosen such a public venue for his confession, suggesting it was itself a manipulation, a performance designed to rehabilitate the Hartwell name at Ravenscroft's expense. The correspondence that flooded Ashford Hall ranged from supportive to scathing. Several longtime family friends wrote to express their disappointment and distance themselves from the scandal. Others, surprisingly, wrote with approval, commending his courage. Most were simply curious, seeking invitations to call so they might hear first-hand details to fuel their gossip. Through it all, Lionel retreated into the management of his estate, throwing himself into work as an escape from society's judgment. He rode out daily to inspect his lands, consulted endlessly with his steward, and avoided London entirely. Aunt Catherine watched with concern as her nephew became increasingly isolated, his already solitary nature hardening into something approaching reclusiveness. It was 3 weeks after the funeral, when a letter arrived that would change everything again. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, the seal bearing the Ravenscroft crest. Lionel stared at it for a long moment before breaking the seal. The letter was from Lady Beatrice Thorpe, the late Duke's daughter. Her words were carefully chosen, walking a line between formality and warmth. "Your Grace, I write to you with my mother's blessing and my brother's reluctant permission. The revelation you made at my father's funeral has caused our family considerable turmoil, as I am certain you anticipated. However, I am compelled to tell you that it has also brought us an unexpected gift, the truth about my father's character. My brother and I were raised believing our father engaged in a bitter rivalry born of legitimate grievance. We accepted it as fact, never questioning the narrative we were given. Your revelation painted him in an entirely different light. He was not a man consumed by petty feuds, but a man of such nobility that he would bear false accusations and public enmity rather than expose another family to ruin. I have spent these weeks reading through my father's private papers, which my mother has now shared with us. His journals confirm everything you said and more. He wrote of his decision to help your father, of his sadness at the necessity of the deception, and of his hope that someday the truth might be known. He also wrote extensively about you, Your Grace. He watched your growth from afar, noted your character, and expressed hope that you would be a better man than your father. I believe he would be pleased to know he was correct. My mother wishes to extend an invitation for you to call upon us at Ravenscroft Manor, should you ever find yourself willing and able. She says she would like to thank you properly, in private, for the gift of truth." The letter continued with more formal courtesies, but Lionel read those first paragraphs repeatedly. Edmund Thorpe had written about him, had observed him, had hoped for his character to exceed his father's. The man his father had slandered had somehow maintained enough generosity of spirit to see him as separate from his father's sins. Aunt Catherine found him in the library, the letter in his hand, and an expression of wonder on his face. He handed it to her without a word. She read it carefully, then looked at him with something like hope in her eyes. "You should go," she said firmly. "To Ravenscroft Manor." Lionel shook his head. "The scandal is barely beginning to settle. For me to visit them now would only inflame speculation and make everything worse. Or, Catherine countered, it would demonstrate that the feud is truly ended. That truth has created the possibility of connection where lies created only division. She fixed him with a penetrating stare. Lionel, you have lived your entire adult life in your father's shadow, bound by his hatred and his pride. You took the first step toward freedom at that funeral. Don't stop now out of fear of society's gossip, he wanted to argue, to list all the practical reasons why maintaining distance was wise. But something in him, something that had been dormant for years, stirred at his aunt's words. The possibility of freedom, of choosing his own path rather than following his father's destructive legacy, was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. I'll consider it, he said finally, knowing even as he spoke that consideration would lead to action. The question was not whether he would go to Ravenscroft Manor, but when and what he hoped to find there. Outside his window, spring was transforming the Cotswold landscape, bringing life to what winter had made barren. Lionel wondered if such transformation was possible for him as well, if truth and courage could bring life to places in his soul that grief and duty had made desolate. For the first time in 3 years, since his father's death had bound him to a legacy of bitterness, he allowed himself to hope. The letter from Lady Beatrice remained on his desk, a tangible invitation to step into unknown territory. That night, Lionel drafted a response, accepting the invitation to call at Ravenscroft Manor. His hand trembled slightly as he sealed the letter, aware that he was choosing a path his father would have condemned. But his father's choices had led only to isolation and lies. Perhaps it was time to discover where truth might lead instead. Ravenscroft Manor stood in stark contrast to Ashford Hall, where the Hartwell estate sprawled across gentle Cotswold hills with classical Palladian proportions. The Thorpe family seat occupied a dramatic position on the North Yorkshire moors, a sprawling Tudor edifice of dark stone and mullioned windows that seemed to grow organically from the wild landscape. Lionel's coach rattled up the long drive on a day when wind swept across the heath, bending the grasses and carrying the scent of heather and rain. He had delayed this visit for 2 weeks after accepting the invitation, partly from genuine obligations to his estate and partly from nervousness he was reluctant to acknowledge. What did one say to the family of a man your father had wronged so profoundly? How did one navigate social niceties when the foundation of your connection was built on scandal and revelation? The butler who greeted him was elderly and correct, showing him to a drawing room that overlooked the moorland. The interior was warmer than the forbidding exterior suggested, with rich wood paneling, comfortable furnishings, and portraits of Thorpe ancestors gazing down with expressions ranging from stern to serene. Duchess Margaret entered first, and Lionel rose immediately, bowing with proper respect. She was a woman in her early 60s, handsome rather than beautiful, with silver-streaked dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. She extended her hand, and he took it carefully. "Your Grace," she said, her voice melodious and cultured. "Thank you for coming. I know this cannot be easy for you." "The difficulty is entirely of my family's making, Your Grace," Lionel replied. "Any discomfort I feel is deserved." A slight smile touched her lips. "Honest to a fault. Edmund said that about you in his journals. He said you had your mother's honesty, rather than your father's pride." Before Lionel could respond, Lady Beatrice entered, and he found himself momentarily at a loss for words. He had seen her only briefly at the funeral, when grief had made her features indistinct. Now, in the soft light of her family home, he saw a woman of perhaps 26, with her father's dark eyes and a bearing that combined strength with grace. She wore a simple day dress in pale lavender, the half-mourning colour suggesting the family was beginning to emerge from their deepest grief. "Your Grace," she greeted him, curtsying with natural elegance. "Welcome to Ravenscroft Manor. I hope your journey was not too taxing." They settled into conversation with the careful courtesy of strangers navigating complex emotional territory. The Duchess spoke of her husband with obvious love and lingering sorrow, sharing anecdotes that painted him as a man of intelligence, humour, and deep principle. Lionel listened, absorbing these glimpses of the man his father had slandered, feeling his shame deepen with each story. "He often spoke of your mother," Duchess Margaret said at one point. "Before she passed, he said she was one of the finest women of her generation, and it grieved him that your father's deception meant he could never express his condolences properly when she died." Lionel's throat tightened. His mother had died when he was 19, and her funeral had been another arena where the Ravenscroft feud played out through conspicuous absences and strategic seating. To learn that Edmund Thorpe had wished to pay respects but been prevented by the false rivalry was almost unbearable. Lady Beatrice seemed to sense his distress. "Perhaps your Grace would like to see the gardens. They were my father's particular pride, and the afternoon is quite fine despite the wind." Grateful for the escape, Lionel accepted, and soon he was walking beside her along gravelled paths between beds of late spring flowers. The wind tugged at her shawl and his coat, but the sun broke through clouds intermittently, warming the air. "You must think us very strange," Beatrice said suddenly, "inviting you here after everything." "I think you are remarkably gracious," Lionel replied honestly. "I destroyed my father's reputation and vindicated yours in the most public way possible. Many families would hate me for the scandal alone, regardless of the truth revealed." She stopped walking, turning to face him directly. "Do you know what the worst part was? Not the lies themselves, but the waste. Two men who might have been friends, or at least cordial acquaintances, spent 20 years as enemies. Two families that might have supported each other were instead divided, all because of pride and shame." Her eyes, so like her father's, held his gaze. "You could have kept silent. You inherited the estate and the lies together. No one would have blamed you for maintaining the fiction to protect your family name." "Your father protected my family name for 20 years, Lionel said. "Someone had to honor that sacrifice with truth." They continued walking, and gradually the conversation shifted to less fraught topics. Beatrice spoke of her work with local schools for tenant farmers' children, a project she had undertaken with her father's encouragement. Lionel found himself discussing his own efforts to modernize agricultural practices on his estate, to improve conditions for his tenants. They discovered shared interests in literature, a mutual appreciation for the Lake poets, and surprisingly similar views on the social responsibilities of their class. "My brother thinks I am too radical," Beatrice admitted with a wry smile. "He believes the natural order should be maintained, that change threatens stability. Father was more progressive. He believed our privileges carried obligations beyond mere paternalistic charity." "I find myself increasingly in agreement with that philosophy," Lionel said, "though it makes me unpopular in certain circles." "The right circles, I suspect," Beatrice replied, her eyes alight with intelligence and something else, something warm that made Lionel's heart beat faster. They were interrupted by the appearance of Harrison Thorpe, the new Duke, striding across the lawn with obvious purpose. Lionel tensed, preparing for confrontation, but Harrison's expression, while not friendly, was not hostile either. "Ashford," he acknowledged with a curt nod. "My mother said you were calling." "Your Grace," Lionel replied carefully. "Thank you for permitting the visit." Harrison's jaw worked, as if he were chewing on words he wasn't sure he should speak. Finally, he said, "I won't pretend this is comfortable. You made my family the subject of scandal and gossip. But," he paused, clearly forcing himself to continue, "you also gave me the truth about my father. That has value, even if the cost was high. It was not forgiveness, not quite, but it was acknowledgement." Lionel accepted it with a nod, understanding that this was as much as could be expected, perhaps more than he deserved. The visit extended through dinner, which was surprisingly pleasant despite the undercurrents of complicated history. The Duchess was a skilled hostess, steering conversation into safer waters when tension threatened. Beatrice was witty and well-informed, her observations on current political matters incisive. Even Harrison thawed slightly over excellent wine and roasted lamb. As Lionel prepared to depart, now intending to stay overnight at an inn in the nearby village rather than attempt the return journey in darkness, Beatrice walked with him to the entrance hall. "I hope you will call again," she said, her voice soft enough that only he could hear. "Despite everything, or perhaps because of everything, I find I would like to know you better, Lionel Hartwell, not as the son of my father's false enemy, but as yourself." The use of his given name, the warmth in her eyes, the possibility implicit in her words, all of it struck him with unexpected force. For years, he had been isolated by his father's legacy, trapped in a role that allowed no genuine connections outside his carefully circumscribed circle. Now, here was a woman of intelligence and character, offering something that looked very much like friendship, and perhaps potentially something more. "I would like that very much," he replied, and meant it with an intensity that surprised him. Very much indeed. As his coach carried him away from Ravenscroft Manor into the gathering dusk, Lionel found himself smiling, genuinely smiling, for the first time in longer than he could remember. The scandal that Lionel had anticipated proved both better and worse than his fears. London society, as Aunt Catherine observed with dry amusement, did love a dramatic revelation, and the tale of the false feud provided endless fodder for discussion. The ton divided roughly into three camps: those who admired Lionel's integrity, those who condemned his public disclosure as inappropriate regardless of its veracity, and the largest group, who simply relished the gossip without caring over much about the moral implications. What Lionel had not anticipated was the degree to which his revelation would expose fault lines in society's understanding of honor and duty. At White's, gentlemen argued passionately about whether he had betrayed his father or honored him by correcting his wrongs. In drawing rooms across Mayfair, ladies debated whether the late Duke of Ashford's actions constituted understandable pride or inexcusable ingratitude. The scandal even reached the highest levels, with the Prince Regent himself reportedly expressing an opinion, though what exactly he said varied depending on who was telling the story. For Lionel, the most difficult aspect was not the public scrutiny, but the private confrontations. Several of his father's oldest friends cut him directly, unable to forgive what they saw as filial betrayal. One particularly painful encounter occurred at a diplomatic reception he felt obligated to attend, where Baron Weatherby, who had known his father since their school days, turned his back deliberately when Lionel approached. "You have made yourself infamous," the Baron said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "Your father would be ashamed." "My father should have been ashamed," Lionel replied quietly but firmly. "I refuse to be ashamed for telling the truth." The exchange was reported in the gossip columns the next day, naturally, adding another layer to the ongoing narrative. Lionel found himself becoming a symbol, claimed by various factions to support their particular views on aristocratic honor, family loyalty, and social responsibility. It was exhausting and invasive, and he would have retreated entirely to Ashford Hall if not for one compelling reason to remain in London. Beatrice Thorpe had come to town with her mother for the latter part of the season. The Duchess had decided, with characteristic courage, that hiding away would only fuel speculation and make everything worse. Better to face society directly, to demonstrate that the Ravenscroft family had nothing to be ashamed of, quite the opposite. Their father's character had been vindicated after all. Lionel had called upon them at their London residence on Berkeley Square within days of their arrival. The butler had shown him to the drawing room, where Beatrice sat reading, afternoon light streaming through tall windows. She had looked up with such genuine pleasure at seeing him that his heart had performed an unfamiliar acrobatic maneuver. "Lionel," she had said, now using his given name without hesitation, as he had given her leave to do during subsequent visits to Ravenscroft Manor. "I hoped you might call today. Mother is out, I'm afraid, at some tedious committee meeting, but I would be glad of your company if propriety allows. Her lady's maid sat conspicuously in the corner, providing the necessary chaperonage, but afforded them enough privacy for genuine conversation. They talked for 2 hours, ranging from politics to poetry, from agricultural reform to the absurdity of current fashions. Beatrice had opinions, strong ones, and the intelligence to defend them. She challenged him, made him think, made him laugh. In her presence, Lionel felt more himself than he had ever felt in society. Their growing friendship, conducted under the watchful eyes of both their families and society at large, became another source of gossip. The whispers started almost immediately. The Duke of Ashford was courting the daughter of the man his father had wronged. Some found it romantic, a reconciliation between families. Others found it calculated, a strategic alliance to bury scandal. A few suggested it was inappropriate, that both parties should maintain distance to avoid further complications. Lionel and Beatrice ignored them all as much as possible. They were seen together at the theatre, at gallery exhibitions, riding in Hyde Park during the fashionable hour. Each appearance generated fresh commentary, but gradually the narrative began to shift. People started speaking of them as a potential match, speculating about courtship and marriage with the eager interest society always showed in aristocratic romantic entanglements. "They're making up stories about us," Beatrice remarked one afternoon as they walked through Kensington Gardens, her maid trailing at a discreet distance. "Inventing romantic declarations and secret engagements. It's rather absurd." "Does it bother you?" Lionel asked, concerned. "I would not have your reputation damaged by association with me," she laughed, the sound like music. "Lionel, you restored my father's honor. Association with you has elevated our family, not damaged it, regardless of what certain conservative elements might sniff about. Besides," she added, her tone becoming more serious, "I find I care less about society's opinion than I once did. Recent events have taught me that truth matters more than reputation, and genuine connection matters more than strategic positioning." They had stopped walking, standing beneath an oak tree whose spring leaves filtered the sunlight into dancing patterns. Lionel found himself caught by the look in her eyes, by the possibility hovering between them like a tangible presence. "Beatrice," he began, his voice rougher than he intended, "I need you to understand that my interest in your company is not strategic. It's not about repairing my family's reputation or creating some symbolic reconciliation. I value your friendship, your intelligence, your—" He stopped, aware he was on the verge of saying too much too soon. "My what?" she prompted softly, stepping closer. "Your presence in my life," he finished. "You make me feel less isolated, less burdened by history. When I'm with you, I'm not the Duke whose father perpetrated a terrible lie. I'm just myself." Her hand found his, a brief touch that was technically improper but felt necessary. "I feel the same," she confessed. "You see me, not just my title or my family's vindicated honor. You speak to me as an equal, value my opinions. Do you know how rare that is?" The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibility. Then Beatrice's maid coughed meaningfully, and they both stepped back, propriety reasserting itself. But something had shifted, had been acknowledged, and Lionel felt both exhilarated and terrified by what it might mean. The turning point came at Lady Pemberton's ball, one of the season's premier events. Both Lionel and the Ravenscroft family had been invited, and their attendance together was guaranteed to create spectacle. Lionel had considered declining, but Beatrice had sent him a note. "Please come. I refuse to let fear of gossip dictate my choices. Besides, I have saved you a dance, and I would be terribly disappointed to waste it." The ballroom was magnificent, glittering with chandeliers and jewels, alive with music and laughter. Lionel arrived to find himself the subject of many eyes, some curious, some disapproving. He made the rounds of greetings, enduring whispered comments and pointed looks, until he found the Ravenscroft party. Beatrice was stunning in a gown of deep blue silk, her dark hair arranged elegantly. When she smiled at him, the rest of the room seemed to fade. They danced together, a waltz that allowed for conversation despite the public setting. "You're being remarkably brave," he murmured as they moved through the steps. "So are you," she replied. "Though I think we're past the point of pretending, don't you? Society knows we've become close. The question is what we do with that knowledge." Before he could respond, the dance ended, and they were separated by the demands of etiquette and other partners. But later in the evening, Lionel found himself in conversation with several gentlemen, including Lord Westmarch, an influential peer whose opinion carried considerable weight. "Ashford," Westmarch said bluntly, "there's been talk about you and Lady Beatrice. I'll be direct. Are your intentions honourable?" The question was impertinent but not unexpected. Lionel met the older man's eyes steadily. "Entirely honourable, my lord." "Good," Westmarch said with a satisfied nod. "The girl's been through enough with her father's death and the subsequent scandal. She deserves a man of integrity. You've shown yourself to possess that quality, whatever the cost to your family name. I respect it." The public endorsement from such a respected figure marked another shift in society's perception. By the end of the evening, Lionel had received several similar comments, making it clear that many in the ton now viewed a potential match between him and Beatrice favourably. As he handed Beatrice into her family's carriage at evening's end, she whispered, "I think society has made up our minds for us. The question is, do we agree with their conclusion?" Lionel squeezed her hand gently. "I'll call upon your mother tomorrow. There are things I need to say, formally and properly." Her smile in the lamplight was answer enough. 6 months after the funeral that changed everything, Lionel stood in the private chapel at Ravenscroft Manor, his heart beating with an anticipation that had nothing to do with nervousness and everything to do with profound joy. The small stone chapel, built by Thorpe ancestors 3 centuries prior, was intimate and beautiful, its stained glass windows casting coloured light across ancient pews where a select gathering of family and close friends waited. Aunt Catherine sat in the front row, her eyes suspiciously bright, nodding approval at her nephew with fierce pride. Beside her, Harrison Thorpe maintained his usual stern expression, but Lionel had learned to read the subtle softening around his eyes that indicated approval. Duchess Margaret sat nearby, regal in elegant grey silk, the portrait of a mother witnessing her daughter's happiness. The ceremony was small, by aristocratic standards, deliberately so. Both Lionel and Beatrice had agreed that they wanted this moment to be about them, about the genuine connection they had forged from the ruins of their father's false enmity, not about spectacle or society's expectations. There would be larger celebrations later, receptions in London to satisfy the social obligations of their rank, but this moment was theirs. When Beatrice entered the chapel on her brother's arm, Lionel felt his breath catch. She wore white silk, simple and elegant, with lace that had been her grandmother's. No excessive jewels or elaborate styling, just natural beauty and radiant happiness. Her eyes found his immediately, and the smile she gave him contained everything words could not express. The vicar, who performed the ceremony, had known Edmund Thorpe well, had been his friend as well as his spiritual advisor. His homily spoke not of duty or social alliance, but of redemption and truth, of how courage to face painful history could clear the ground for genuine love to grow. "We are gathered here," he said, his voice warm and resonant, "to witness something rare and precious. 2 people who might have been strangers, kept apart by lies and false enmity, have instead found in each other partnership and love. Their union represents the triumph of truth over deception, of personal choice over inherited obligation. It is a reminder that we are not merely the sum of our families' histories, but individuals capable of forging new paths." When the moment came for vows, Lionel spoke his clearly, his voice steady and certain. "I, Lionel Edmund Hartwell, take you, Beatrice Catherine Thorpe, to be my wife. I promise to honour the truth you have taught me to value, to see you always as yourself rather than as an extension of family or title, and to build with you a life based on genuine connection rather than social expectation." Beatrice's vows were equally personal, her voice clear and strong. "I, Beatrice Catherine Thorpe, take you, Lionel Edmund Hartwell, to be my husband. I promise to value the courage you showed in choosing truth over comfortable lies, to support you as you continue to become the man you wish to be rather than the man your father tried to make you, and to create with you a family legacy of integrity rather than pride." The use of Edmund as Lionel's middle name, a choice his mother had made long ago, felt deeply significant in that moment. It was a connection neither had known existed until after the funeral, another thread binding their families together beneath the surface of manufactured hostility. When they were pronounced husband and wife, their kiss was tender and full of promise, witnessed by the small gathering with genuine warmth. The applause was heartfelt rather than merely polite, and Lionel felt, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, completely at peace with his choices. The wedding breakfast that followed was held in Ravenscroft Manor's dining hall, intimate and joyous. Toasts were made, some humorous, some touching. Harrison surprised everyone by speaking at length about his father's character, his voice thick with emotion, and thanking Lionel for giving him back the truth about the man he had admired without fully understanding. "My father carried a burden for 20 years, Harrison said, raising his glass, "protecting a family that slandered him. That is nobility in its truest sense." Lionel honored that nobility by refusing to perpetuate the lies. And now, through this marriage, our families are joined as perhaps they should have been all along, in alliance rather than enmity, to truth, to courage, and to new beginnings. The toast was echoed enthusiastically, and Lionel felt Beatrice's hand squeeze his beneath the table. Later, when they had a moment of relative privacy in the manor's garden, she turned to him with eyes full of emotion. "Are you happy?" she asked softly. "More than I knew I could be," he answered honestly. "I spent so long living in shadow, carrying my father's bitterness like a burden I could never set down. You've shown me what it means to live in light, to choose my own path." "We've chosen it together," she corrected gently. "That's what makes it real." They had decided to spend the first months of their marriage dividing time between Ashford Hall and Ravenscroft Manor, learning to manage their combined estates and responsibilities. Later, they would establish their primary residence at Ashford Hall, but both were committed to maintaining Beatrice's connection to her family home and to the tenant communities who depended on the Thorpe lands. As weeks became months, their marriage proved as strong in daily reality as it had been in romantic anticipation. Beatrice threw herself into the estate improvements they planned together, her ideas for tenant education and agricultural innovation complementing Lionel's existing efforts. They became partners in truth, consulting each other on decisions, valuing each other's perspectives, building something neither could have created alone. The London scandal gradually faded, as scandals always do when newer sensations arise. Lionel and Beatrice were seen occasionally in town, but spent most of their time in the country, more interested in meaningful work than social positioning. Those who visited them at either estate remarked on the obvious affection between them, the easy way they worked together, the sense of purpose that animated their lives. One afternoon, nearly a year after their wedding, Lionel found himself in his study at Ashford Hall, reviewing correspondence. A letter from Harrison caught his attention, its contents making him smile. His brother-in-law, never the most expressive of men, had written to thank him again for the truth about Edmund Thorpe, and to share that he had begun implementing some of the progressive policies Beatrice had long advocated for their tenants. "Your influence on my sister has always been positive," Harrison wrote, "but it seems her influence on you has been equally transformative. My father would be pleased to see what you've built together. He always believed the next generation could do better than ours did. You're proving him right. Beatrice entered the study, now noticeably pregnant with their first child, and looked over his shoulder at the letter. "Harrison, being sentimental, will wonders never cease. Your brother has depths he keeps well hidden," Lionel replied, pulling her into his arms gently, mindful of her condition. "As do we all, I suppose." She rested her head against his chest, content. "Do you ever regret it? The scandal, the loss of your father's friends, all the difficulty?" "Not for a moment," he said firmly. "That day at the funeral, I could have kept silent. I could have maintained the fiction, protected my father's reputation and my own comfort. But it would have been a coward's choice, and it would have cost me you, this life, everything that matters. Truth set me free, Beatrice. It allowed me to become someone worthy of you." "You always were worthy," she argued, tilting her head to look at him. "You just needed to see it yourself." As the afternoon sun streamed through the study windows, warming them both, Lionel reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From the hollow existence of inherited hatred to this moment of profound connection and purpose, the path had been difficult and costly, but every sacrifice had been worthwhile. The gold he had carried into Westminster Abbey had been payment of a monetary debt, but the truth he had revealed had paid a deeper obligation, one of honour and integrity. Edmund Thorpe had saved the Ashford estate from ruin, and asked nothing in return but discretion. Lionel had restored Edmund's honour and gained everything in return: a wife, a partner, a future unconstrained by lies. In mathematics, it made no sense. In the calculus of human nobility, it was perfect balance. Outside, the Ashford estate spread green and prosperous under benevolent management. Inside, a new family was being built, one that would inherit truth rather than deception, that would know the story of their grandfather's integrity and their father's courage. Lionel and Beatrice would make certain of that. History would not repeat itself in silence and shame. "What are you thinking?" Beatrice asked, sensing his reflective mood. "That truth is expensive," Lionel replied slowly, choosing his words with care. "But lies cost far more in the end. My father paid in bitterness and isolation for his deception. Edmund Thorpe paid in false enmity. I nearly paid with a hollow life of inherited hatred. But truth, when finally spoken, gave us all this." He gestured broadly, encompassing not just the room, but everything they had built. "It seems a fair exchange, don't you think?" "The fairest," Beatrice agreed, her hand finding his. "Though I'm not sure the London gossips will ever understand it." "Let them have their gossip," Lionel said with a smile that would have shocked his younger self with its carefree confidence. "We have something better. We have the truth, and each other, and a future we've chosen freely. That's the hidden noble truth the title promised, isn't it? That nobility isn't in bloodlines or ancient estates or manufactured rivalries. It's in courage, integrity, and the willingness to choose what's right over what's comfortable." "My father would have liked you very much," Beatrice said softly, tears brightening her eyes. "I wish he could have known you as you truly are." "In a way, he did," Lionel replied, remembering the solicitor's revelations about Edmund's journals. "He saw past my father's son to the man I might become. He had faith before I earned it. I can only hope to live up to that faith, to be the husband you deserve and the father our children will need." As evening fell over Ashford Hall, Lionel and Beatrice remained in the study, planning their future, discussing estate matters, sharing the comfortable silence of two people wholly at ease with each other. The scandal that had brought them together was largely forgotten by the world now, but they would remember always, not as shame or regret, but as the necessary destruction that cleared ground for something genuine to grow. The Duke, who had walked into his rival's funeral carrying gold, had been trying to repay a debt. The man who walked out of that chapel had discovered that the true payment required was honesty, that the true treasure gained was love, and that the hidden noble truth was simply this: freedom comes not from protecting lies, but from embracing truth, whatever the cost. And in that truth, Lionel and Beatrice Hartwell built a life of meaning, purpose, and abiding joy. The feud that had defined their families for 20 years was replaced by an alliance stronger than any strategic marriage could have forged, because it was built on genuine affection and mutual respect. Their children would grow up knowing both the Hartwell and Thorpe histories, understanding that courage and integrity matter more than pride and position. The gold delivered to Westminster Abbey had long since been distributed according to the Thorpe family's wishes to charitable causes. But the legacy of that dramatic day endured in something far more valuable. A family united by truth, a love born from courage, and the knowledge that sometimes the greatest nobility lies not in maintaining comfortable fictions, but in having the strength to expose them, whatever the cost. In the end, that was the hidden, noble truth that had needed revealing, and Lionel Hartwell had been the one brave enough to speak it. Before we conclude, I want to thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, please do not forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel for more dramatic historical tales, and share in the comments where in the world you are listening from. Your support means everything, and I love knowing how far these stories travel. Until next time, may you always have the courage to choose truth over comfort, and may your own life be rich with genuine connections.